So just send me a text if you'd like me to send the text of my lecture. I always feel a bit conflicted when I give a lecture like this, because in a way I've tried to condense and make sense of Augustine's De Trinitate, and especially the latter half of the De Trinitate, in a way that I hope will be helpful. It's a book, if you've read the readings or beyond the readings, you'll probably already have figured out that this text is a bit all over the place. And you're wondering sometimes, what is he saying? What is he trying to do? I'm not sure if you covered the first half of De Trinitate itself last week, but really the first 7 books are very much just developing the doctrine of the Trinity. God is one, and we call him good, and we call him many names, but how is it that there are these 3 persons? How do they relate? And does that undermine the unity of God, and so on and so forth? And then the latter half of the book, which we're going to talk about today, is precisely talking about the image of God, as you mentioned before. And what does it mean to bear the image of God, reflect the image of God? And I think Augustine is trying to tell us something about what this involves. But from our point of view, in a modern perspective, not kind of knowing perhaps where he's coming from and the world in which he lived, it sometimes is a bit unclear exactly how he thinks we bear the image of God. And thus there's been, of course, an enormous amount of debate on what exactly is going on in this second half of the De Trinitate. I think the one thing that everyone recognizes is there in that latter half is what we call these psychological analogies to the Trinity. So aspects of the human mind that seem to sort of resemble or reflect God in some way. And you've probably come across them in the reading, memory, understanding, will, mind, knowledge, love. We'll go into those in more detail. But there's been a lot of criticism, in a way, of this whole project that Augustine seems to undertake of presenting these psychological analogies, because what some people seem to believe when they infer when they read Augustine's discussion of these analogies is that he's suggesting that if we want to know God, all we have to do is kind of turn in and think about ourselves, think about myself as a kind of knowing, loving being that's capable of memory, understanding, and will, and so on. And then I think, okay, I have these capacities. I must have gotten them from somewhere. Now I know God. So this seems to be a totally kind of isolated way of thinking about spirituality. It doesn't have anything to do with ordinary life. It doesn't have any impact on our relationship with other people. It's kind of, and some have gone so far as to say that, we're really anticipating Descartes here with his, I think, therefore God exists, or I think, therefore I am. And the kind of solipsism, I don't know if you've heard that word before, this idea of, just you and yourself, it's all that exists, as being the underlying idea of this whole latter half of the De Trinitate. I mean, there are other criticisms that have been leveled against Augustine's doctrine of the Trinity itself. So there's a whole kind of raft of criticisms about that first half, and then a raft of criticisms about the second half. I have dealt with the criticisms of the first half in some articles, and I'm happy to point you to those if those are interesting to you. But today I think we'll just focus on the second half and those psychological analogies. Now, I reread the De Trinitate, I was telling Barbara, in order to prepare for tonight. And it's been a while since I read it. And I remember I read it so many times, about probably 10, 15 years ago, and just ingested and inhabited every word I felt. And as I went back, I forgot just how all over the place it is. I mean, it's inspiring. It's amazing. It's incredible. I mean, there's lots of Neoplatonic themes, and then there's lots of not Neoplatonic themes in there. And I thought, wow, I was so incredibly confident 15 years ago or whatever, when I came up with this grand scheme for understanding this completely chaotic, it's not chaotic, I mean, I'm probably exaggerating, but this quite complex and exciting text. And so what I am going to offer you is a reading that I eventually developed that I felt helped me enormously to come to terms with what I think Augustine is trying to do in this latter half of the De Trinitate. I do think I'm probably right, but I think the complexity and the just sheer wonder of Augustine's writing means that I may not have the only right view. And I think that there are different ways of interpreting this particular text. And that's often the feature of great texts like Plato and Augustine, that they can be understood in different ways. So what I really am building up to saying is that I don't want anything that I say in my lecture to overshadow or preclude the possibility of your own insights or learning from other interpreters of Augustine's De Trinitate, because this is a rich, multifaceted text in which numerous wonderful things are going on. And I would love to offer you just one tool for understanding it, which I hope will be useful. And the essence of the way that I have found it helpful to think about these psychological analogies, and incidentally, there are 7 of them developed over the course of the text. This should already set off alarm bells, I think, in our minds, because you probably know that in antiquity and even in the Middle Ages, there were often kind of 7 stages of ascent. 7 is a sort of perfect number. So you have 7 psychological analogies. What's going on here? If you've ever read Pierre Hadot, he would say that there is actually a tradition into which works like this might potentially fall, of what they called spiritual exercises, practices or tools or methodologies that people would use to help them live the good life, to help, or in this case, to help them live the life God intended for them. I do think that's a really plausible way, although I have my own way of approaching it. It's a plausible way to approach this text. It is a pastoral text. Augustine develops a doctrine of the Trinity and ultimately a view of how we are made in the image of the Trinity, because he is a bishop and a priest in a sense, and wants to help people understand what it means to walk through the whole process of conforming to the image of God. He recognizes that we start from a place where we've somehow lost this image through sin. Whatever it is God made us to be, we're not really there anymore. We have to find our way back. I think this is a pathway to find our way back. I don't see these psychological analogies as sort of static objects of contemplation that we just reflect upon and somehow they allow us to see God. I think I see them rather as outlining a dynamic and ongoing process of conforming to the image of God. So what does that mean to conform to the image of God? Well, let's think about what Augustine says, and this would refer back to the first part of De Trinitate. What does God do? God, by virtue of the 3 persons of the Trinity, is able to think and act and will all things in light of the knowledge of himself as the highest good. God knows himself. God knows that he is the greatest thing, and he creates us in his image because that's best for us. So in that light, what does it mean to bear God's image? Well, I think it means to do what God does. We do all that we can do in light of the knowledge that God is the highest good. However, we can't do that in the way God does, because we're not God. We live in the world. We are faced with people and circumstances every single day. And so the way in which we must reflect God's image, it seems to me, means learning to reckon with all of our relationships and every aspect of our existence in light of the knowledge that God is absolutely significant. This, I think, for Augustine, is our way of participating in the work of God, at glorifying God, and far from a kind of static, solipsistic situation. We are constantly involved in practical activities and relationships and so on, which we allow the belief in God as an absolute good to inform. So I'm kind of thinking as well of the passages. We'll come back to the passages later, but this is one reason why I set you that passage about from De Trinitate, about this good and that good is not the good. I think Augustine is so conscious that precisely as creatures that live in the world, that know things and people, we have this tendency to think this stuff is most important. This will make and break my happiness. This challenge or something as well can overwhelm me. And I think the significance of belief in God is the highest good, or the most significant thing in that context, is it helps us put other things into a kind of perspective as, yeah, okay, that is important, but it's not God. It's not the supreme thing that will make or break my existence. Yeah, so let me go ahead and just, if you don't mind, read a bit here, some of my paper. Otherwise, I will probably just talk and talk and talk forever. And hopefully that will kind of give you a sense of where I'm coming from so that we can go back and look more closely at the text. So before Augustine launches into this whole discussion of the analogies in books 9 through 15, he pauses in book 8, as I said, to reflect on the God whose nature he's just analyzed in the previous 7 books. So as the source of everything in the world, he says, God is not subject to the kind of limitations we encounter in temporal things. He cannot be grasped for this reason by the human mind. Which is, only able to comprehend limited things, physical things, material, visible things. Precisely for this reason, however, Augustine says that human beings, as I mentioned just now, we have a tendency to perceive the objects that are right in front of us, this good and that good, as he says, relationships, opportunities, circumstances, etc., other things we encountered in the world, as though they were the be all and end all of our existence, or the source of our happiness. In other words, we have a tendency to ascribe absolute significance that is attributable to God alone to things that are not God. And the problem with doing that has to do with the fact that the things that we perceive as supremely important for our life, which we should perhaps organize our lives around obtaining, they aren't actually the be all and end all of our existence. They are finite and they are fleeting. That's the essential nature of temporal circumstances. They're limited and temporary. And so to stake our hopes for happiness in these things means placing our happiness at the mercy of circumstances that are out of our control and enslaving ourselves to desires we can't always fulfill. So in light of that, Augustine's declared goal in the latter half of De Trinitate is to transfer our desires from temporal to eternal things. That does not mean that he devalues temporal things like our relationships, our pursuits, our possessions. God, for him, created all these things as the context for knowing him and for loving him. So what Augustine rather aims to do is to help us avoid becoming the cause of our own unhappiness by helping us to appreciate the limitations that temporal things have in terms of facilitating our personal happiness. For him, this means in seeking happiness only ultimately in God, which again doesn't mean that we should not enjoy other things in life or just walk around with our head in the clouds saying, oh, I only need God, I only need God. But it's to point out the error of thinking about things not God as though they were somehow of some make or break significance for us. So initial faith in God, he seems to suggest, helps us acquire a potential which we have lost as a result of sin to do this, to allow the belief in the supremacy, the goodness of God to sort of play a monitoring role, if you want, in the way we think about other things. But it doesn't immediately break those habits. I will still wake up tomorrow morning and think, gosh, if I, don't get this next grant, or if I don't get this next job or something like this, then I'm not of value, or, my life is, going in the wrong direction, or anything that could happen that could be a cause of sort of disappointment. So the habit of kind of looking at the immediate as if it was so all importance is something we have to really break. We have to unlearn that kind of tendency to see this good and that good as the good, to put it in Augustine's terms, and relearn the skill of bringing the knowledge of God as the supreme good to bear in everything that we do. And that is what the life of faith seems to be all about for Augustine. So his account of this life begins with that first psychological analogy mentioned in book 9 of mind, knowledge, and love. So with that analogy, Augustine indicates that the mind only ever accumulates knowledge of what it wants to know, what it loves. I have been stitching some nice bookmarks as Christmas presents because I enjoy that. I love that. Some people know nothing about stitching, just as I know nothing about probably many things that you're able to do. Why? Love makes the difference in what knowledge the mind accumulates. For this reason, Augustine says that the mind or intellect that prizes temporal things above everything else is bound to organize life around achieving those things rather than finding happiness in God. So the starting point for turning the situation around is to initially recognize God as the highest good, to remember I'm made in his image for the purpose of glorifying him. And from that point, one can actually go on and try and apply the understanding of God as a sign of love for him through the work of the next triad, memory, understanding, and will. So for Augustine, memory contains all the information we've ever acquired in the past, things we've thought about, as well as, things that we kind of took in but didn't really take in, such as when my mother was talking to me when I was a teenager and she talked to me and technically I heard it, but I didn't listen really. Everything's sort of in there, things we've thought about and not thought about, but somehow came across. We also have, what else do we, everything, our skills that we've acquired, places we've been, people we've known, and so on. So whenever we become, sorry, I skipped over a little bit. Augustine emphasizes that we only tend to pay attention to things when we actually want to, and how anyone who has children or who has been a child, like I say, is probably some understanding of this. While the will forms the intellect's desire for understanding, the understanding the mind already possesses is indicative of the kind of understanding the will wants or tends to desire. And it attunes the will to seek new understanding that satisfies those same fundamental desires. So whenever the mind becomes aware of something that it cannot explain, but it's the kind of thing that you want to explain, a will for new understanding arises. And this incites the mind to search through the memory and see if I can find an answer that will make sense of this new experience or object I've come across. Augustine indicates that this kind of search is often really necessary. And so the search for understanding is never really straightforward. We have to begin with a desire for understanding and then go through a process of figuring out what is relevant to gaining that understanding. And that's why he uses this idea of faith-seeking understanding as a model, not only for thinking of how we know God, but also for thinking of how we know it all. I start with a question. I start with something that I want to know, that I believe I can find an answer to. And then I go out and do the kinds of things that seem to me necessary to helping me find the answer. I'm really interested in medieval Franciscans, but I don't know what they think about the divine will. Therefore, I start to read and look up things in the library and so on that will help me answer my question or satisfy that desire for knowledge. Whenever we obtain an ultimate idea as a result of this kind of quest for understanding, Augustine says that the product is that which is hidden in the memory in a dispersed and disordered way previously comes to the fore. So there's a memory, there's the understanding that arises from the memory, and there's the will, which sort of brings the two together, brings together whatever we got out of our memory to help us gain understanding, and the understanding itself. They are reconciled as the product of the desire for that understanding. And he calls the result a trinity of understanding. So whenever you are doing some research or thinking and you think, oh, I have a new thought, Augustine would say, no, you have a new trinity of understanding, because something came from your memory and something came from your understanding and something came from your will. So you can go out and now confuse everyone by saying that you have new trinities of understanding every once in a while. On his account, these trinities of understanding that we obtain through memory, understanding, and will, kind of that searching that they jointly undertake, searching for knowledge, that trinity returns to the memory, and it may come into contact with things that were already there and shed new light on data that we didn't understand previously, and possibly even give rise to new questions, almost inevitably give rise to new questions. And so this whole process of memory, understanding, and will is kind of goes on forever and ever. And we're always in some kind of process of faith-seeking understanding, or having a question that we're using memory and understanding to answer as a result of the will. I mean, I hope that somehow this resonates with experience. It certainly resonates with my experience. For instance, when I learn something new, oh, now that's what that meant. I always didn't understand that. Okay. Oh, so maybe this could be true too. It's very, and then, you see how the questions multiply. Augustine says that the more automatically that a trinity of thought, or an idea, as normal people would call it, is kind of influencing our thinking, influencing the questions we ask, our search for answers with memory, understanding, and will, and the new questions, the more deeply rooted we can say it is in the memory. It's better memorized, if you want. I think about everything in light of Franciscans, what the Franciscans think of that. You can't ask me any question without getting some kind of Franciscan answer. So that's deeply rooted in my memory, that whole tradition. But it may be otherwise in other cases. The more you put your faith in a way in ideas, by using them, by applying them, by bringing them to bear on other questions, the more certain you are about them. An example Augustine uses is just, learning a foreign language. This is a great example. Actually, you learn the vocabulary, you learn the rules of the foreign language, and it's absolutely painful. At the beginning, trying to say things correctly, and then eventually, hopefully, you're able to speak fluently and understand fluently. And that is because those rules and vocabulary are totally committed to your memory. You are able to apply them in situations without even thinking about it. And that is the evidence for Augustine that memory really has grasped something. I can tell you lots of German grammatical rules about, trennbares and untrennbares Verben, inseparable and inseparable. I can tell you, but I find it very difficult to actually work with those verbs. It's not totally sunk into my memory, my second nature. Augustine says that the idea that is most deeply committed to the memory is the one that reflects the person's conception of what's most important in life and what will bring happiness. This is also there in Confessions, but it's very much there in book 14 as well, when he's talking about happiness. The fundamental concept of happiness is what governs the way we think about everything else and how we lead our lives in a way. And the problem, he says, is that we all desire happiness, but we think it consists in different things. But when the mind, he says, remembers that its desire for happiness is indicative of a desire not for something, but for God, as in this first psychological analogy, memory, mind, knowledge, love, the forgotten thought of him is reinstated in the memory. That puts the mind in a position to bring that faith in God to bear in every cognitive effort that's undertaken by memory, understanding, and will. In other words, to perform these acts of cognition in terms of knowing that God is the greatest good there is. So we have kind of two levels of memory, understanding, will. I mean, we all kind of use our mind's memory, understanding, will every single day to perform all kinds of normal acts of thinking. But there's another level in that those acts themselves are governed by faith, if you want, in what's most significant to us. What's our priority? What do we love? And what Augustine is advocating here is that God's got to be that one. And that will then shape the whole way we go about acts of memory, understanding, and will. And those acts won't tell us anything about God. That's for sure. I mean, he's completely unknowable. And that's something that Augustine takes as completely given and certain. But the belief that God is highest good and that fundamental existence of that belief in our mind has the potential to govern and shape the way we assess and experience the world and what we find there. It makes it possible for us to avoid making too much of some things or too little of other things, and somehow get the balance right in the way we go about things. And this, I think, is the kind of indirect knowledge of God that we are able to obtain in this life. It's not knowledge of God, but it's knowledge of the difference that belief in God makes to our thinking about things that are not God. I think that's what Aquinas meant by knowing God and his effects, but that's another story for another day. I think I'm not hopefully going too far to say that for Augustine, this kind of perspective is attainable, not even for regarding things that are good, like jobs and cars and family, but things that are painful and evil and hard. A person operating in the light of the knowledge of God can know that nothing ultimately makes or breaks human happiness, and therefore has the ability to see that pain also has its limits, and it can't squelch the human soul. It can't take away what's sort of fundamentally most important. This makes it possible for us to somehow find a way through circumstances that are not at all good. And somehow it allows us to stake our hopes for happiness on things that are not on things that are out of our control. I'm always reminded of Eckhart, who spoke so much about things that are in our control, things that are out of our control. And even though it's not so much the way that Augustine talks, I do think that is part of what he's interested in here, is don't stake your hopes for happiness on things that are out of your control. And that is where belief in God is a sort of useful tool for him in making that possible. But the process of learning to think along these lines is a laborious one, and it has to be habituated, if you want. It has to be constantly practiced until it's memorized, until it's natural. So, as we've said, intellect, knowledge, love lays the foundation. Memory, understanding, will is kind of how we actually habituate ourselves. It's that daily work. But there's another level that Augustine mentions, in the sense that we all have different memory, understanding, and will. We have different abilities, interests, and capacities. And that, I think, is what he's referring to with this next analogy of ability, learning, and use, which really highlights that there are as many ways of knowing and knowing God as there are human beings. And they're all valuable and essential even for highlighting the vast and infinite nature of God's goodness, and for revealing the difference that belief in him can make to our engagement with the world. What this analogy suggests is that the real work of imaging God involves not just turning into ourselves, but living in the world, doing the jobs, undertaking all the kinds of activities that humans undertake, but doing them in this particular light of the knowledge of the goodness of God. So, as the intellect learns to work habitually in accordance with its abilities from the standpoint of faith in God, Augustine elaborates, it learns to know and to make known what is eternal, God, through the temporal. So the process of conforming to God's image ultimately, therefore, allows our lower faculties, what he's referring to here is external sensation and imagination, it transforms those faculties as well. So the first faculty in question here is what Augustine sometimes calls corporeal vision. And in this case, he's just talking about the 5 external senses through which we take in the world outside us. And the second mode of imagination is the means by which we kind of register sensory experiences. We haven't yet formed conclusions about them using the mind, but they're somehow there waiting to be thought about. So for instance, maybe I go for a walk and I see a tree, I see another tree, I see 5 trees, and I don't really pay attention to them. And then at the end of the road, I think, oh, this is a tree, this is a street lined with oak trees. So there's often a process of kind of taking in data before we actually do something with it and think about it. And Augustine's point here is that these faculties, these sensory and imaginary faculties, they're precisely the ones that often pose a problem for us. They often are the ones that tempt us to think that, oh, this good and that good is the good. And so they have a corrupting function in some sense. But when you bring faith into the picture, Augustine's saying here, the function is reversed. They become the very means by which we are able to know God. For Augustine, then, we can find an analogy to the Trinity even in these faculties. Now, these analogies, in his view, have to be distinguished from the image of the Trinity, because he says, well, the image is only in the mind, only in what is immaterial, only in what is immortal, only in what is really like God. And the senses and the imagination help us to know temporal things, and so they'll eventually pass away. Nevertheless, we can say that they have Trinitarian analogies when they're serving their proper purpose and facilitating the knowledge of God. So he says, in the case of external sensation, the Trinitarian analogy consists in the sight of the eyes, the object seen, and the actual attention to the object, whereas imagination involves the memory of our sense perceptions, the incapacity to internally compare the perceptions, and then the production of an image that we kind of think, and that's the reason I can think of the tree I saw today, even though it's not right in front of me. The goal of these and Augustine's prior analogies I've been suggesting is ultimately to help us to memorize how to perform our acts of reasoning, however we're gifted to perform them, under the influence of faith in God's ultimate goodness. And when the mind fully remembers, understands, and loves God in this way, he says, it ultimately remembers, understands, and loves itself. And this, as a result, the sixth and final psychological analogy becomes present in the mind. This is because the person who remembers God in everything they do remembers their own true purpose and potential and taps into the ability to unleash it. And all this last analogy of memory, understanding, and loving the self might seem to feed into that argument that knowing God for Augustine is just a matter of knowing the self and just a highly solipsistic affair. What I've been trying to suggest is that it's precisely this analogy that confirms our ability to engage with our surroundings and with others in the most constructive and life-giving way, with an appreciation for what they are and what they are not. In other words, they're not God. When Christ returns, he says, and the need for faith passes away, there will be the memory and understanding and love of the self, which is the memory, understanding, and love of the faith that we placed in God during this life, will be transformed into a seventh and final analogy to the Trinity. And that will determine the way in which we know and love God for eternity. On the account I've been trying to lay out here, the whole goal of the De Trinitate is to retrain readers to live continually by faith in God in the way they think of temporal things, so as to prepare for a seamless transition to the immediate vision of the Trinity at the end of time. So the idea behind the treatise, in other words, is to enable us to learn to enjoy God as we're able to do in the present, so as to maximize the ability to know him for eternity. This brings us back to that pastoral dimension of the text. I mean, again, if you just read it and you see him going through all of these analogies, there are these recurring themes. There's so much about how do you love what you don't know? And there's a lot of discussion of that. How do you love what you don't know? And this is what I've been trying to get at. What I think he means there is yes, I cannot know God, but I can't know what he is, as Aquinas would say, but I can know that he is the highest good. And when I know that he is the highest good, that can have an effect on the way I think about other things. So for me, that helps to make sense of so much of this discussion that he undertakes of just how you, I always get it mixed up, how you love what you don't know. That is such a recurring theme. Another recurring theme in the second half of the De Trinitate is just God is not bodily. We are bodily. We have this tendency as a result of our corporeal, physical faculties, physical nature, to kind of put these things first, value them as though they were really the essence of our lives. And he's constantly, I think, trying to push us past that. And some of the reflections that we find are oriented towards that. I mean, one of the things that he does say that I was reminded of in rereading the text is he wants us to think of ourselves as immaterial beings. Oh, you can think something or will something, but do you have an object there? No, you don't. It's because it's immaterial. There's a part of you that's immaterial. Where did this come from? Can you explain where it came from? No, you can't. It's because it came from somewhere else, from God. And if that part of you is immaterial, then he must be immaterial too. Therefore, this is a strategy for pushing up against and correcting our absolutely inborn natural tendency not to think in terms beyond our experience. But ultimately, and then, again, we have so much there on the analogies, and he goes into much more detail on each of these analogies than I've been able to give. I tried to pull out the essentials of each one. So let's remember, we've got mind, knowledge, love, memory, understanding, will, ability, learning, use, the external senses analogy, the imagination analogy, the memory, understanding, love of the self/God, and then the eternal vision of God that kind of is linked up to that. And each one of these has some kind of role to play, I think, in helping walk us through this process and understand that it is a process, a process of habituation, if you want to use the Aristotelian term, of unlearning this tendency to, well, as Augustine would say, behave like beasts, to do what is in common with animals and to think that it's just a material world in which we live, and elevate our minds in such a way that we think about the temporal in light of the eternal, so that all that we do in the context of the temporal somehow plays a role in transferring us, or is transferable in some way to the eternal. So this is my attempt, at least, to kind of make sense of, again, this text in which so much is going on, and yet there are these recurring themes which I think he wants to drive home. I know we have probably a time for a pause in a few moments. Barbara, you may